Good evening, everyone. Here in Mexico, buenos días. I would like to thank the Tolkien Society and particularly Will for all the effort in putting together this autumn seminar, and I would like to thank Enrique for his careful reading of Roverandom to discuss it in preparation for today, and Aline for sharing her insight for this adventure. As most of you are probably aware, the number of scholarly works related to Roverandom is very brief, not only due to its relative short public life, merely a couple of decades, but also because it is still considered as just a tale for the Tolkien children, and is not an obvious part of the legendarium. Kenneth Croft mentions that, I quote, though the underlying tale shares the Imram's structure of transgression, exile, penitence, and reconciliation, it feels whimsical and miniaturized in a way Tolkien later came to dislike and condemned in his 1939 essay on fairy stories. End of quote. However, some of the critics have identified important parallelisms between some of the characters in the text and the most iconic ones from the larger canon. Only a handful of studies are dedicated partially or exclusively to aspects of this work. Among them, Jennifer Merchant's About the Three Rovers as an example of Tolkien's use of the double. In this case, triple, or rather a double-double, since the three rovers don't share a space. The title itself, being also the name of the protagonist, constitutes one of those untranslatable conundrums, particularly considering that he will be meeting two namesakes during the course of his adventures. The name Rover, as we know, was a piece of resistance in canine onomastics, while, quite surprisingly, it didn't even make the top 100 names on the website named, ironically, rover.com. But its meaning is probably not so obvious for someone outside the English-speaking tradition, as we can see in the slide from a translation forum. One of its meanings, wanderer, quite appropriate for the faraway adventures the protagonist has to endure, has been frequently adopted in Spanish, at least in Mexico, with a jokingly tone when giving a name to a stray dog that is welcome in the household, solo vino, meaning he came on his own. But the problem is transforming that name when it has a previous owner. As Merchant explains, the Moon's dog story is relatively brief. This name of Rover suited him well. I was a rover too, he confesses. I never would stop anywhere or belong to anyone before I came here. I did nothing but run away from the time I was a pup. Thus, the man in the moon decides to name him Roverandom to avoid confusion. The connotation of the particle random cannot be explained by a periphrasis like in the case of Robert el Vagabundo, which doesn't pose a problem since it is only implied in the English name but never explained. Later in the book, after Roverandom has become friends with the Sea Rover, he asserts how he is entitled to the name Rover. I expect I am the first of all dog rovers. My first master was a rover, a real one, a sea rover who sent his ship in the northern waters. It was a long ship with red sails, and it was carved like a dragon in the prow, and he called it the Red Worm and loved it. End of quote. By means of the sea rover's assertion, Tolkien explains he is using one of the other meanings of the word, a sea rover, The Spanish translation, on the other hand, goes on to use the word pirata directly. The strategy of the translators in terms of onomastics is consistent. Where names have a semantic meaning, such as the man in the moon, they offer the Spanish content equivalents, el hombre de la luna. In all the other cases, they decide to maintain the names almost exactly as in the English original, making just the necessary phonetic adaptations so that the names can be pronounced, as is the case of Samathos, changing the phoneme th with no exact Spanish equivalent to a simple t. The ps in the beginning of Samathos' name is preserved as its use, or lack thereof, contributes to the characterization of Samathos, as we can see in the example. The same is done with Artajerjes to make it consistent with the traditional Spanish spelling of the Persian king Jerjes. A complicated and maybe not so fortunate instance is the case of the PAM. The initials must be maintained, probably not for the reference to the nickname of Lord Palmerston, as mentioned by Hammond and Skull, but also for its phonetic quality, therefore making it impossible for the translators to change it to map. This provokes the inconsistency of the use el PAM or PAM when using it as a proper name or a title, but also the awkward formulation repeated twice in the book, en el Pacífico y el Atlántico como mago. While Artajerjes' description might remind us of Tom Bombadil, his wives, also known as Princesa Pam, might also echo in our ears as that of Goldberry. On the other hand, when considering the use of elevated language, as mentioned in Hammond and Skull's introduction, one must take into consideration Tolkien's own assertion in one of his letters, and I quote, "A good vocabulary," he once wrote, April 1959, "is not acquired by reading books written according to some notion of the vocabulary of one's age group. It comes from reading books above one." We can see one example here with the word monsergas and the word galimatías in the previous slide. It is an acknowledged fact that one of the goals of children's literature is language acquisition and semantic expansion. And in this, Roverandom excels, though in the Spanish version, it at many times may exceed its purpose. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on which part of the world you are right now. My name is Aline Esperanza Baza Vázquez, and I will talk about some examples about characterization and depiction of nature in the Spanish translation of Roverandom. I want to mention that I believe the edition with the notes from Skull and Hammond is a greater edition, or I prefer this edition than the one that is in the Tale of from the Perilous Realm, because the notes I think are good and are fundamental to better understanding all the wordplays that are inside the story. So there are so many things that without the notes get lost, even in the English, in the original text, in the English version, and in Spanish, well, get lost even more. So let's get started. The first example I will mention is about the wordplay that Tolkien does with flowers and the sounds. Thanks to the notes, we know, well, we are aware, but we have more meaning about the workplace related to the musical instruments with the flower that are the bells, the type of bells Tolkien mentioned, white bell, fire bell, silver bell, that unfortunately in the Spanish translation get lost this meaning because we only see campanas blancas, campanas claras, campanas de plata, and we don't have this meaning of the musical instrument, the bells, the whistle, the trumpets, the horns. And I believe this happens because the world in the flower translation, the translation about bell in this type of flower in Spanish is only campanilla, and all the variants are more or less only in the word campanilla. So this wordplay that Tolkien does is not easy translated in Spanish because we don't have many words uh, to explain all these type of flowers that Tolkien is given. Even he says that are untranslatable names, so he helped the translator to to doesn't name all of them or to put that the names are untranslatable. So he even knew that it was hard to do that translation of that part, I believe. The next example is the second paragraph is as well a wordplay, but this time we in the Spanish translation is lost as well because, for example, we don't have the wordplay with polyphony and polypodium, which is the plant, and polyphony, which is the sound of polyphonia or polyphony, and as well as the biblical reference in brass tongue, because in the Spanish translation, the quote in Spanish about the Bible, uh, lenguas de bronce, is different. We could link the meaning, but it's not so easy, especially if you don't read the Bible so often. But thanks, when you read the notes, you have all this background that Tolkien put into these few words, and the meaning that it has another meaning after reading this, right? The next example, I think, is a change of the register in the translation because ringing, in the meaning of ring a bell, is commonly used referring to bells, and in Spanish, the word tenían is not so commonly used, at least in this part, in the Mexican or Latin American Spanish, about the with the bells. I would prefer using the word uh, repicar or campanear when referring to bells in the Spanish translation. And I believe it's the channel register because tenían is not commonly used. The next example, we have as well another change in the register uh, to talk about the type of water that is warm and sparkling. We, in Spanish translation, we have agua caliente y rutilante. Rutilante, I believe, is not a common word that has the meaning of shine. It has the meaning, but it's not so commonly used to speak about something that shines. And even in the English translation, in the English original, I mean, we could have the meaning about the water that has foam or bubbles, and in Spanish, obviously, it's not rutilante. This meaning. And beside that, a more common meaning for shine is brillante, could be centellante or destellante instead of rutilante. Maybe the translator tried to keep this change in the register to a higher one because they wanted to honor what Tolkien believed about um, expose big words to children or words that are for adults or grown-ups. But I'm not so sure about it because the English words are commonly used for these meanings, and in the Spanish translation are the words are chosen are um, kind of archaic or weird in this type of meaning. Finally, the last example is about the weather. Here, I don't believe it's a change in the register because borrasca is a word that is commonly used in Spain. But here in Mexico and other parts of Latin America, we don't have this meaning of borrasca for a storm. Borrasca is not a word commonly used at all. We use instead tormenta for a storm, and that's because a borrasca is a type of storm that I can say only occurs in Spain and has his own physical properties, and they are not common in Mexico or possible in Mexico because the different geography between those the parts of the world is different. And I would prefer use the word storm instead of borrasca. And finally, I will talk about an experience I have as a Mexican reader about with Roverandom and the legend of the moon rabbit, because it was impossible for me not to relate the story with the legend especially when the man of the moon insisted to Roverandom and Robert not to mess with his white rabbit because the legend says that there's a rabbit living in the moon, as we can see in the pictures. I found out while doing this presentation that in other parts of the world, especially in Asia, they have this type of legend as well. And here in Mexico, we have many variants, but the most important, so the ones that I was aware, are one about the god Quetzalcoatl, and the second one is about the sacrifice of the fifth son god. The one about Quetzalcoatl is that he one day decided to come to Earth, disguised as a human being, and he visited everything and he was so pleased that he stayed too long, and at the end of the day he was so hungry and that he became sad about it. When he had an encounter with a rabbit, the rabbit offered himself to be eaten, so Quetzalcoatl wouldn't be hungry. But Quetzalcoatl didn't eat the rabbit. Instead, he pick it up so high that the shadow was imprinted in the moon. So everyone will know that the rabbit was so good that was willing to sacrifice himself in order to Quetzalcoatl not be hungry anymore. And the legend about the fifth son is that in the Mexican mythology, there's an idea that there's a series of suns. And when the fifth son was going to be born, the gods gathered together in Teotihuacan and they chose Tezistecatl in Nanahuatzin to prepare himself as a sacrifice. And after a series of trials and ceremonies and things, at the end was a fire, the pit, the fire. And Tezistecatl was unable to sacrifice himself. He tried 4 times, and 4 times he couldn't do it. So it was impossible to do a fifth time because he was born of the fifth son. So the god asked Nanahuatzin to sacrifice himself, and he does it in the first try. And because after this, he became the son, but this is the cattle as because was so ashamed because he couldn't do it. He tried again and succeed finally in the fifth intent and the fifth try, I mean, and he became a second son. But with this, the gods were afraid that the air was going to be so bright that they were afraid about too many lights in the earth. So they throw a rabbit into Tezistecatl to dim his light. And instead of becoming a second sun, he became the moon. That's why we have a rabbit in the moon. And these are the lines I knew about. And as you can understand, it's impossible as a Mexican reader not to relate the story of Roverandom with the legend, even when I probably is is sure that Tolkien didn't mean to relate this legend with the story of Roverandom. And that will be all for me. Thank you.